Forgotten medieval kings you won't believe actually existed. You've heard of King Arthur, the Shining Knight, the Round Table, the Sword in the Stone. But what about the king who ruled with a sword in one hand and a leper-ridden face in the other? Hat Guy existed, and he wasn't alone. History is full of kings who were anything but noble. Warrior monks, leper generals, 7-foot-tall giants, and tyrants so ruthless they made Game of Thrones look like a bedtime story. But here's the twist. You've probably never heard of them. Why did history try so hard to forget these rulers? What made them so terrifying, so brilliant, or so bizarre that their names were left out of the textbooks? Let's bring them back from the shadows. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time where castles were cold, toilets were buckets, and wigs came with complimentary lice. Picture this. You wake up in a drafty stone room, your breath fogs the air, and your boots are literally frozen to the floor. Breakfast? Probably yesterday's bread and a chunk of cheese that's seen better centuries. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was royalty, medieval style. And while history loves to parade out its usual celebrity kings, Charlemagne, Richard the Lionheart, and that one guy who yelled off with his head, the real action was happening in the shadows. There were rulers just as savage, just as strategic, and honestly 10 times more interesting. But somehow they got erased. Maybe they didn't have a great PR team. Maybe they were too brutal, too weird, or just inconvenient for the winners who wrote the books. But today we're blowing off the dust and dragging them back into the spotlight. Welcome to the weird side of medieval royalty. No crowns polished, no history sugar-coated.
Baldwin IV, the Leper King.
Meet Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, military commander, and a teenager, literally rotting alive. Diagnosed with leprosy as a boy, Baldwin didn't just survive, he ruled. While most kids his age were still figuring out puberty, Baldwin was leading armies into battle on horseback, face wrapped in silk, hands gloved in white to hide his decaying fingers, and yet he terrified his enemies, not because of what he looked like, but because of what he could do. Despite his worsening condition, Baldwin outmaneuvered Muslim armies, manipulated court politics, and held onto power like a boss. Imagine a teen today running a country while secretly battling a terminal illness, like a pro gamer hiding a broken controller during a championship match. That's Baldwin. His body may have been falling apart, but his mind? Sharp, strategic, ruthless. Even as his flesh crumbled, his will hard. He wasn't just surviving, he was dominating. And that, in the Middle Ages, was enough to make people whisper his name with a mix of awe and horror. Harald Hardrada, the Viking who almost took England. If Thor had a cousin who was into politics and world domination, it would have been Harald Hardrada. This guy didn't just want to be king, he wanted to be every king. He started off as a teenage mercenary, fighting in far-off lands like Russia and Byzantium, where the battlefields were soaked in blood and the only diplomacy involved a sword. Harald didn't just fight, he conquered. He was the kind of guy who could burn a village by breakfast and draft a royal decree by dinner. And in 1066 he came within sword's reach of becoming the King of England. While everyone remembers William the Conqueror, it was Harold who first rolled in with a Viking army so fierce it made entire towns evacuate before he got there. Picture it, axes crashing against shields, flaming rooftops, hand-to-hand combat so brutal it makes MMA look like a pillow fight. Harold was 6 feet of fury and ambition, charging into history with a roar, and for one brief moment, England was almost his. But fate and an English arrow had other plans. Peter of Castile, the just or the cruel. Peter of Castile was either a brilliant reformer or a complete psychopath, depending on who's telling the story. His official nickname? It flips between Peter the Just and Peter the Cruel. And honestly, both might be true. On one hand, he cut taxes for the poor, punished corrupt nobles, and tried to bring some actual justice to the medieval chaos. On the other hand, he ordered assassinations like he was checking off a grocery list. To his rivals, even family members, if they blinked wrong, they vanished. Peter ran his kingdom like a tight ship with a very sharp keel. He was feared, respected, and impossible to ignore. Until, of course, his own brother decided enough was enough. In a moment, straight out of a tragic opera, Peter was lured into a meeting, unarmed, expecting mercy. Instead, he was thrown to the ground and stabbed in the face, repeatedly, by his own flesh and blood. Justice or cruelty? Maybe both. Either way, Peter ruled with a sword in one hand, and betrayal waiting just behind his back. Themicide, the unusual Let's get one thing straight. Ethelred wasn't unready because he forgot to set his alarm. The nickname actually comes from unread, which means poorly advised. In other words, he didn't listen. To anyone. Ever. While Viking longships were pulling up like Uniethid house guests, Ethelred's master plan wasn't to fight back. No, he paid them in silver, repeatedly. Every time the Vikings showed up, instead of sharpening swords, he opened the royal treasury. It's basically the medieval version of just send the hackers some Bitcoin and hope they go away. This led to what's now called the Danegeld, literally a ransom paid to the Vikings to not burn everything down. Spoiler alert, they took the money and burned things down anyway. Athelred reigned through some of the worst Viking invasions England had ever seen, and his genius response was to keep cutting checks like he was their sugar daddy. So, no, he wasn't unprepared. He was just really bad at picking who to trust. Sancho VII of Navarre, the Giant King. Sancho VII wasn't just a king. He was a walking myth. Standing at a rumored height of over 7 feet tall, he towered over allies and enemies alike. In an age where most men barely scraped 5'6", Sancho looked like a medieval skyscraper. But this wasn't just for show. He led his troops into battle personally, swinging a massive custom-forged sword that looked less like a weapon and more like a steel lamppost. At the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, he didn't sit on a throne shouting orders. He charged into the enemy's elite guard like a medieval battering ram. Legends say he broke through their chains, ripped through their defenses, and helped turn the tide of the war. It's no surprise that tales of giants started circulating across Europe soon after. When peasants whispered about warriors the size of houses, they might have just been talking about Sancho, a king so massive, so fearsome, and so real. He blurred the line between man and monster. Elissa Holt, the caliph who invented a private army. Al-Mutasim wasn't just a caliph, he was a military architect and the mastermind behind one of the biggest power shifts in medieval warfare. Tired of unreliable tribal politics and backstabbing commanders, he decided to build something new. A loyal, elite fighting force made entirely of Turkish slave soldiers, known as the Gilman. These weren't ragtag recruits, they were hand-picked, trained, and fiercely devoted to him alone.
This private army didn't just guard the palace. They became the palace. They changed how battles were fought, how empires were protected, and how rulers stayed in power. Other kings took notes. And because a revolutionary army deserved a revolutionary base, Al-Mutasim built Samarra, a city that looked like it time-traveled from the future. Spiral minarets, military housing grids, advanced water systems. It was more than a capital. It was a fortress with style. Al-Mutasim redefined loyalty, re-engineered military command, and left behind a system so effective it echoed through empires for centuries. A ruler who saw soldiers not as tools, but as a power structure he could own. David IV of Georgia, the Belgar who beat the Crusaders. David IV of Georgia wasn't your average medieval king. He didn't just build castles, he built a kingdom. Nicknamed David the Builder, he modernized Georgia from the ground up. New roads, new schools, better administration, and a booming economy. But don't let the name fool you. David wasn't just laying bricks. He was also out there crushing armies. In 1121, he took on a coalition of Muslim forces over 600,000 strong with just 55,000 troops. And he won. Decisively. While most kings had to choose between brains or brawn, David had both. He could fund an academy and fund a battlefield on the same afternoon. He built schools and built body counts. True multitasking. David wasn't just a king. He was a one-man Renaissance movement before the Renaissance even started. And yet most people outside Georgia have no idea he existed. Maybe because his legacy wasn't loud, it was effective. Interlude, cold, filthy, and full of fleas. Let's pause for a second and talk about how these kings actually lived. Sure, they wore crowns and gave orders, but they also woke up in stone-cold palaces where the wind howled through the walls like a ghost with asthma. Chamber pots froze over in winter. The food? Let's just say some of it was so rotten it probably had voting rights. Royal beds were crawling with fleas, and hot baths were rare enough to be considered miracles. Power? Yes. Comfort? Not so much. Charles the Bald, who wasn't bald. Charles the Bald had the most ironic nickname in medieval Europe because, as far as we know, he wasn't bald at all. His name was more of a political insult than a physical description. Medieval shade, basically. Charles spent most of his reign putting out fires started by his own family. Literal civil wars, betrayals, and enough royal drama to make modern soap operas look tame. But despite the chaos, he managed to host one of the most over-the-top coronations in history. It was so lavish, the Pope had to come up with brand new prayers just to keep up with the extravagance. He may not have been bald, but he definitely had a kingdom full of headaches. Esembai of Armenia, the flamboyant warrior, as I wasn't your typical medieval king. He was a full-blown spectacle. Think glittering Byzantine robes, jeweled armor, and enough royal swagger to make emperors jealous. He ruled Armenia like a rock star on a warpath, and he didn't just sit on thrones, he fought for them. Smot battled invaders with the intensity of a berserker, charging into war like a man possessed. He defended his kingdom with both brilliance and brutality, refusing to back down, even when outnumbered. But his enemies finally caught him, and instead of executing him quietly, they went full medieval PR stunt. They displayed his corpse in public as a warning. The plan backfired. Instead of fear, people felt awe. His bravery, his elegance, his defiance, they made him a legend. Even in death, Simbat was impossible to ignore, a warrior king who dressed like royalty and died like a martyr. Flamboyant, forgotten, not anymore. Lothair II, the marriage scandal king. Lothair II wasn't known for his conquests on the battlefield. He was known for bedroom diplomacy. His reign became one giant scandal when he tried to dump his lawful wife and marry his mistress instead. Problem was, divorce in the 9th century wasn't as simple as unfollowing someone on Instagram. Lothair's personal drama sparked a full-blown European church crisis. Bishops were arguing, popes were furious, and other kings were suddenly very nervous about their own mistresses. It was like medieval Tinder drama, but with armies, papal decrees, and civil unrest. In the end, the Pope refused the annulment, Lothair's legitimacy was shredded, and the entire idea of royal marriage came dangerously close to collapsing. All because one king couldn't keep his love life off the political stage. Lothair's reign didn't end in glorious battle, but in whispered rumors, broken alliances, and the kind of scandal that still echoes through the pages of history. Final thought. History's graveyard is full of kings. These weren't just side characters lost in the footnotes. They were kings who shaped nations, turned tides of war, and stirred up scandals that rewrote laws and borders. So why were they forgotten? Maybe it wasn't because they didn't matter. Maybe it was because they mattered too much. Too dangerous, too complex, too defiant to fit the clean narrative history likes to tell. But now their stories are out of the shadows and back where they belong. So, which king blew your mind the most? Or did we miss a mad monarch? Drop their name in the comments. Let's dig up more forgotten legends together. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell before this video vanishes into history, like King Aethelred's battle plans.